Hello, this is Dr. Harriet Fradd with my podcast, Capitalism Hits Home. This is a show about the intersections and the mutual shapings of class, capitalism, gender, race, and every aspect of our personal lives and our political and economic lives and how they intersect with one another. Because this show is based on the premise that there is no one thing that's the most important always, but that everything shapes and helps to create everything else in a society. And because personal life is particularly neglected in terms of the impact of other things on our personal lives and our personal lives' impact on our environment, I want to particularly have this program emphasize our personal lives. Here we are trying to educate, we're trying to activate, we're trying to inspire you, and we're trying through understanding to alleviate some of the terrible burdens our capitalist society puts on us as we experience the narcissism, self-centeredness of people who are taught only think of number one, the neglect by our government often, the relentless advertisements that lie to us so that it's very hard for us to trust. All of those things, we hope to alleviate them. Today, I want to talk about family because America is very big on talking about family. Oh, my family. When any politician gets caught having sex with other people or something, he always wants to spend more time with his family. That's why he quits his family who hardly knows him. Because family has this sacred aura in the United States, even though our families are in deep trouble. And we have the highest divorce rate of all the developed Western nations. We have the highest murder rate of spouses or girlfriends. We have the highest murder rate of our children. We have the highest abuse rate, and the highest child suicide rates, as well as the highest addiction rates, which of course, if parents are addicted, it's not so great for the kids. And so this talk of family is in direct opposition to the actual situation of families, who are largely deserted in the United States because we don't have the things that every other Western developed country has, which are family leaves, family vacation time. In France, every worker gets 5 weeks paid, guaranteed vacation time. Every other developed country has guaranteed paid vacation. We have none. We don't have paid maternity leaves here. We're right up there with Somali, Swaziland, Papua New Guinea, and there's the United States with no paid maternity leave or paternity leave. So we are way behind in terms of any family support, even as we tout that we are a nation that loves families, and as the right wing invokes family most of all, it also does the least to protect families. Biden's discussion of the necessity of infrastructure, $400 billion to cover in part caring for people, taking family leave like for elder care or whatever. We have no standards for daycare. We have very lax elder care. And we neglect our families. So wait a minute, what's going on? First of all, let's look at the idea of family, where it came from, and what's happened in families. The family in feudalism used to be the feudal family, where the lord of the manor made the important decisions, and the man of the household decided the fates of his wives. He only had one then in medieval Europe. his wife and children. And if the feudal father decided that his sons or daughters wouldn't get married, they didn't. He decided what land they had or didn't have, and the first son got primacy over everything. The others were assigned to various things. When feudalism broke down, I should say as a little aside here, every economic system in the history of the world is born, becomes dominant, and then is replaced. Like slavery was replaced by feudalism. Feudalism is replaced by capitalism. Capitalism should be replaced by democratic socialism. I mean, we look like we're going down fast, so that would be the replacement. In any case, the feudal family was dying. The feudal lords decided they needed more land to raise herds of sheep. And so they didn't allow the little feudal, tiny farms of feudalism that were carved up for each feudal lord, and then he carved up the land among himself and his first son or other children. Those were over. And so people flooded into towns, into, where they could maybe make a living. And the structure of the feudal father who determined marriage in alliance with the lord of the manor and the Catholic Church priest broke down. There was no law and order. You can see it, what happened there in the French Revolution, where what happened to create the kind of family we have was brilliantly documented by a wonderful French author who's very informative, although no fun to read. It's really turgid prose. I ended up having to read most of the sections many times to really get it, because it's not written for people to easily understand. It's written to carefully document what was going on with the transition from the feudalism and the feudal family to capitalism and the capitalist family. Because in France, after the revolution, society was messed up. I mean, the feudal estates were breaking down. The Catholic feudal estates were taken over by the revolutionaries because the Catholic Church was a huge feudal landowner, and it also created the ideological base for feudalism, having the feudal serfs deeply believe that it was God himself and his angels and saints who wanted them to slave for their whole lives for the master, giving up most of their proceeds to the master for his enrichment and keeping only enough to survive. That broke down when people left the feudal estates and were in cities. And there, all was chaotic. Marriage broke down because it used to be arranged by the feudal father and the Catholic Church. And women were getting pregnant and had no protection for their children, who most often died, and often they did too, in unsanitary birthing conditions. They had no protection. And so there was a crisis of society. And those people who still had wealth, the remnants of the feudal aristocracy who still had their wealth, or at least some wealth, the Catholic Church, which was a huge, rich organization in and of itself and had many feudal lands and still had some feudal wealth, and the new capitalists that were starting to develop in the cities, in the towns that became cities, hiring people to work for them, giving them a small portion of what they earned, and keeping the rest for themselves and getting rich. Capitalist principle, which still holds. No one hires you for a job making anything unless you're making more money for the person than he or she is giving you. At any rate, the people who still had money got together. They were bothered by the dissolution of society, the unreliability of workers, because the mainstay of the morality and routines that got people to work had fallen apart. And they were particularly worried about a dominant demand of the French Revolution, which was state support of children. As Les Miserables, the novel, and then the Broadway play and the movie show, children were very involved in the French Revolution. They staffed the barricades alongside adults. And one of the most important demands they made was state support for children. Now, the aristocrats, the capitalists, and the church realize, who's going to pay for state support for children? We're the only ones with any money. We're going to be taxed for this. And they really didn't like the idea. So they met together to try to figure out what to do. And these meetings are very well documented by Donzelot, Donzelot, in his book, Policing the Family, translated into English. They decided, we've got to come up with a plan. Otherwise, we're paying for the state support of children because we're the only ones in this French state who have any money. Similar things happened around the world, but Donzelot documented this so beautifully that I'm using him as an example. And what they came up with was a solution. Create a feudal family for the mass of people. Make the man the feudal lord of his household. Give him that prestige and that authority to boss around and demand and command his wife and children. In exchange, he better keep a job, because otherwise they'll starve, and they will be pressured by their families to keep working, because otherwise the family will starve. For the women, they gave protection in childbirth and in pregnancy, protection in the home on the condition that they did not work outside the home. And the children were given to both parents as chattel, as little slaves, who you could rent out to work for others, to whom you could do whatever you wanted, because they were your little slaves. And they enforced this family form because they didn't give jobs to anyone who didn't subscribe to this family form. They only hired you if you were a grown man, if you had a dependent wife, and either current or soon to be had children. And that way, they made sure that the desperate people who wanted jobs so badly because they couldn't live without them, they had no wealth, they made sure that they could be good capitalist workers because they had the responsibilities for their wives and children, and because they had authority over their wives and children, which gave them status, superior status as husbands, and gave the wives some status as wives, and gave them both total power over their children, who were chattel. And we have to remember that this system of total power over children lasted a long time. It wasn't until 1962 that the paper was published, The Battered Child, after which there was a big discussion of why so many children are battered, are bruised, are killed. And the government by 1967 had laws against killing your kids or badly injuring them. And those laws were extended to pediatricians who could report anonymously, because if you have private medical care and you report it to your battered kid comes into the private doctor, he may want you as a client, so as a patient, so he may not mention how your kid got killed or seriously injured. That was the beginning of an awareness that children should have the right to live, and the beginning of legislation. Now, that was 1967. It was really relatively recent in history that a parent couldn't bring their dead kid into the hospital and say he fell down the stairs when he obviously was beaten to death. And that's a big advance. And so that the idea that children are human and should have some rights to live was basically established in the US between 1962 and 1967. Now, at the same time, there were other developments for children's welfare. By the 1920s, child labor was banned. You weren't allowed to hire out your children, get the money, and support yourself on their labor. My own grandfather, when he was a child, he was one of 9 children. His father kept his nails manicured and rented them all out on the railroad. And at 5 years old, my grandfather's job was to trim lamp wicks on the Long Island Railroad, because they didn't have electricity in the cars then, and to do other menial tasks so that he could bring home a wage to his father, who lived off his children's wages. So it wasn't until 1920 that practice of renting out your kids was forbidden in the United States, very important date. And then by the 1960s, you weren't allowed to kill or injure your kids. Those are very big advances. However, children in the United States are still basically the property of their parents. They have total control. And parents don't have help with their children, which is awful for parents, and children don't have protection, which is why, as I will say again in the next show, child abuse is greatest and child murder is greatest to children of 1 year old or under. By the time a child is 6, child abuse goes down because the children, at least they used to, left home for 6 hours a day, because schooling is mandatory at age 6. And so that the family changed a little bit, because children didn't have to be home all day and therefore had a greater chance to survive. You know, the hints of this are in our literature. If you read Huckleberry Finn or Tom Sawyer, you read about how Huckleberry Finn's father would get drunk and try to kill him, and so Huckleberry ran away. Well, that was just part of the culture then. And you read about runaway apprentices, because they ran into runaway apprentices as well as slaves. So it was before the 1860s. But apprentices were apprenticed out. By about 10 years old, a child would be sent to a coppersmith or a blacksmith or a carpenter or a miner or something to be an apprentice, to learn. And these apprentices were often horribly abused, starved, beaten, cheated, and so on. And many ran away. That's why Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer were often mistaken as runaway apprentices, because there were so many runaway apprentices. And so we have come a long way in protecting children. But children are still chattel, and they're still subject to whoever gave birth to them, no matter how unqualified they are and how messed up they are, or how sadistic they get, or how junked out on dope they are. And so American children suffer terribly. They suffer much more than their equivalents in Scandinavian countries, like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, or in Germany, or France, or Italy, or Spain, the other Western, more developed countries in the OECD nations, the nations that are somewhat, the 30 nations of the world that are somewhat more developed, because they all have family programs that protect children. They have socialized medical care so that children are required to be examined. And if they're not cared for, it's picked up. They have child care centers so that it's noticed if children are in bad shape physically or mentally. Just as child abuse goes way down at age 6, part of it is the kids aren't even at home for 6 hours a day. Part of it is kids can run away, at least open the door and run down the hall, run outside. And part of it is they're not in school where someone will notice that they're in terrible shape. When I was a school teacher in first grade, I noticed that this boy had burns all over the place. That was in the 1960s, before the 1967 rules, and I reported it to my principal. I said, when I talk to this boy, he talks about that he's seeing monkeys in the mirror, and there are no monkeys here. And my assistant principal said, "Don't bring it up, will be a lot of trouble." Now, by law, you have to report it, and that's an advance. But we're still very backward. We don't even know what happens to children under 6, and we have no way of knowing. And that's because the family really can't be totally responsible for children. Adults have enormous responsibilities. They need to make a living. They don't know anything about childcare. And so they neglect and kill their children, and abuse their children, and mistreat their children. Because they don't, they're under terrible pressures, because our family system is dysfunctional. In every other developed country, they have helps for the family. Even in Brazil, which is a much poorer country than the US, they have 6 weeks paid vacation as a guarantee for couples so that they can be calmer, so that they can go away with their children, so they can have relaxed time. We don't have any of that. In other countries, they have family leave. So if your kid is in a bad way or too young to be left alone and there's a problem, you can take family leave and keep your job. Or you can take family leave to take care of an older relative who desperately needs some care. We don't have that, which is why our elders are in such bad shape and why our lifespan is now shorter than it ever was in America. Now Cuba has a higher life rate and we have a higher mortality rate than they do. They also have a better child mortality rate, even though they're poor and have poor people's conditions because they take care of their children. And America doesn't. And if these other countries can all do it, they can all provide public quality medical care and paid vacations and maternity and paternity leaves and after school programs and summer programs, then of course we could. And Biden's infrastructure plan, which of course should be passed as a beginning, is part of 37 nations that have infrastructure plans. I know more about France than I do about other countries because I've been there a lot and spent a lot of time there. But every French town has a program where they pick up the kids at school in a bus and they take them to a child-centered program where they can learn skills so you don't have to have private music lessons, private this, private that, private fencing lessons or whatever. You go to these after-school programs that are in publicly funded centers, and those services are available, and then the school bus takes you home. They also have summer programs that can never be more than 15% of your salary for the summer, where kids have excellent programming as well as meals. And they are not a richer country than us. Neither is Germany, which is the most prosperous economy of the European countries, but is not as prosperous as us. We are the richest country in the world. Now, what's the matter here? Well, I think what's the matter here is those countries have powerful socialist, communist, and anarchist parties. They have parties that demand that the society take responsibility for children who are their future, for supporting families, for supporting their elderly citizens. And so it isn't just on the weak and hurt shoulders of the average person to do this. Our family system, our isolated, unsupported families are completely untenable. They really are completely untenable in the modern world, which is why our families are in such desperate trouble. Marriage is collapsing. 50% of first marriages, 60% of second marriages, 70% of third marriages end in separation or divorce, and people who don't have money or kids to fight over just split. They don't necessarily have to bring the state in on their arrangements because it costs money to get a divorce. So they just split. And that means that the majority of children, actually a study shows that 75% of children don't grow up with their biological parents. And of course that makes sense. 40% of kids are born outside of a marriage, and marriage has largely collapsed. And the state here hasn't been brought in to save us. It hasn't been brought in to help, which is why America has the lowest fertility rate we have had since the Great Depression. To raise a child, not in a fancy way, but in an ordinary way, to age 5, costs about $70,000 a year. It's in salary.org. And so people can't support their children, and they don't. But they're the next generation. So that the family form born of capitalism, born out of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, just can't hold. It can't function, except for the top 10 or 20% of people. For the bottom 80, it doesn't. And those attempts to thwart it are attempts by the right wing, dominated by the million and billionaire class, and their advocates don't want to pay the taxes that would pay for it. And as I have said before, but it bears retelling, it was Ronald Reagan, the one who cut back taxes on the wealthy, the one who broke the unions, starting with the Air Traffic Controllers Union, PATCO, who started the whole slide from taxes on the wealthy during the New Deal, which were 96.8%, allowing Roosevelt during the Depression to create Social Security to create unemployment insurance, to create the employment of about 15 million people, which in today's population would be the government hiring 30 million people or more during the depression we have now. That came from taxing the rich, who were afraid because socialists, communists, labor unions were organizing, and they were organizing in order to have a better life. And FDR could say to his wealthy cronies, hey, look, let me tax you 96.8%, or you won't have anything. They'll take over. And they were afraid. And since they were afraid, ever since the end of World War II, the wealthy have been working to end the New Deal. They still had their millions and billions intact. In fact, in this pandemic, 600 new billionaires were created, while over 60% of Americans were immiserated by being unemployed, having to use their savings and running out of money. Because our government didn't insist that 70 to 90% of people stayed hired. And we don't have the left that wouldn't allow outsourcing. And so our families are in very deep trouble. And the family system of the isolated nuclear family is no longer sustainable. We need a transition through the kind of family supports that all the other Western industrialized countries have. Childcare, after-school care, and summer care. We need that, and we have to fight for it with a vital left. That's all we have time for today. But we thank you for tuning in, and we hope that we'll get your comments at Democracy at Work, and the work there is WRK, under Capitalism Hits Home. And if you're interested in further work of mine, look at Harriet Fraad, F-R-A-A-D, well, I should say H-A-R-R-I-E-T, FRAAD.com. We thank you for tuning in, for spreading the word about this show, and we thank especially our Patreon contributors, our sponsors, who allow us the funds. Unfortunately, this is a capitalist system. We need funds, who allow us the funds to continue to bring this program to you. Thank you so much. Goodbye.